Hello, and welcome to the Walrus Talks at Home Polarization, presented by the Canadian Race Relations Foundation and Inspirit Foundation. I'm Jennifer Hollett. I am the Executive Director of the Walrus. I'm your host and moderator for this evening, and we're really excited to be joining you online, bringing people together across the country and beyond in conversation. I'd like to start by acknowledging the land that I'm on in downtown Toronto, Ontario, Takaranto. A land acknowledgement helps us recognize history, thinking about how it informs where we are now and what changes can be made moving forward in a commitment to reconciliation. Our offices at the Walrus and where I am are located within the bounds of Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit. This land is also the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Today, Toronto is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We're honored to contribute to a tradition of storytelling, and we welcome you to take a moment to reflect on the land that you're on, wherever you're joining us from today. As part of the ongoing work of reconciliation, if you haven't already done so or done so recently, we encourage you to read the 94 calls to action recommended by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And adding this actually to our land acknowledgement is something that came out of a Walrus talk. A bit more about the Walrus. The Walrus started as an optimistic project over 2 decades ago to foster conversation across Canada. We recognize that these conversations are complex, they're necessary, they're often polarized. We'll get into that tonight. So for us, they take place in many forms. We're online at thewalrus.ca. We're also in print, on newsstand, or by subscription. You can listen to our podcasts, you can listen to our stories, or join events like this one. And this work is powered by our donors, our supporters, and our partners. So a big thank you to the Canadian Race Relations Foundation and Inspirit Foundation for their partnership and support in this work. Polarization. It's on the rise around the world, and Canada is not immune. We can see it and we can feel it. Politicians and public figures are intensifying their wedge issues, how they talk, how they whip people up, and this is becoming the norm in political, social, and cultural conversations. The impact? An erosion of trust in democracy and institutions at large. Tonight, 4 experts are going to dive into the state of polarization in Canada, how COVID-19, how the pandemic widened political divisions about health and science policies, and who that impacts the most, how politicians are being affected by this, and what this means for democracy. We're also going to take a look at the decline of trusted local media, news, independent journalism, how that's impacting readers, which means it's impacting the electorate. This year saw more than half the world's population go to the polls. We also had many elections in Canada, and we're in the lead up to an expected federal election next year. So we'll be exploring what divides us and how here in Canada we can find common ground, how we can get back to being in conversation, to listening, and hopefully getting to at least an understanding. With the Walrus Talks at Home, each speaker will give their talk one after the other live, and this is followed by a moderated Q&A with our talkers and your audience at home. So if you have a question, submit it at any point in the comments section. And when you post your question, let us know where you're tuning in from. We also encourage you to share this conversation on social media. And yes, we will talk about social media's role in polarization. You can tag us on your platform of choice at The Walrus, and you can use our hashtag Walrus Talks. Tonight, we'll be hearing live from Justin Ling, investigative reporter and interviewing writer for The Walrus, Sabreena, Delhon, CEO, Samara Center for Democracy, Sadia, Zaman, CEO, Inspirit Foundation, and Amie, Archibald-Varley, RN, MN, CEO, Advancing Health Equity Together, co-host of the Gritty Nurses podcast, author of The Wisdom of Nurses. Thank you all for joining us, and we're going to kick things off with Justin Ling. And Justin, I know you've spent a lot of time working and researching this topic, so over to you.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for being here. I'm hoping to make it through this 5 minutes without sneezing. I'm afraid I've become polarized from my own immune system recently, so I have a bit of a cold. But just for starters, I kind of want to set the stage about the state of polarization in this country. I became particularly, I think, interested and concerned with this trend a number of years ago. I've spent time on Parliament Hill. I've spent time covering a rise of extremism, a rise of misinformation, and many of the sort of symptoms of polarization in this country. And it was after the Freedom Convoy in 2022, which I covered on the streets of Ottawa for many frigid nights, that I started getting these questions from my colleagues, from politicians, from regular folks. How did we get here? How did we get so polarized? And those questions turned into a project, an assignment from the Public Policy Forum to really study and try and diagnose the extent to which this country is polarized. And in starting this project, which later took the form of a report and roundtables and polling and academic research commissioned by a whole bunch of very, very smart people, it ultimately took the form of a report trying to tie all this together, which we called Far and Widening. And in that report, we try to really pull apart the big drivers, causes, and effects of polarization. And from the very beginning, we had an enormous problem, which is that defining polarization is incredibly difficult. By most of the metrics that exist out there, Canada isn't polarized. We don't have a far right or a far left party that has broken into parliament. We haven't seen the degree of civil unrest that you've seen, for example, in January 6th in DC or in Seoul, South Korea in recent days. We don't really fit most of the public opinion criteria for polarization. People in this country still, by and large, for example, support gay marriage, and it was the right of a woman's right to choose. And so it became difficult from a definitional problem from the very outset. But the more and more we talk to people, youth across the country, politicians, Indigenous leaders, premiers, regular people, the more it became clear that everybody agrees that this country is polarized and they're experiencing it every single day. So we really started this from the premise of Canadians know it when they see it, and they absolutely see the effects of polarization absolutely everywhere. So we really started by looking at kind of three big factors here. The first is the state of polarization and partisanship in Ottawa proper and in our political sphere. What we found was a clear bit of evidence that our politicians are becoming more aggressive with each other, that fundraising is driving our political parties into increasingly alarmist and extreme rhetoric, that there is less and less cooperation in Parliament than really probably ever before, at the very least, over the last 100 years. And in particular, we found an interesting data point for this, which was the increase in affective polarization. That is, we're increasingly finding, thanks to some great research from Eric Merkley at the University of Toronto, we're increasingly finding that partisans don't recognize partisans of other stripe. They frequently misunderstand who their political opponents actually are. They tend to think, for example, conservatives tend to think that liberal voters are LGBTQ at a much higher rate. Liberals tend to think conservatives are evangelical Christians at an obscene level that is totally not reflective of the actual party. And these divisions are making it harder to actually recognize people from across the aisle and increasingly making people think in terms of oppositional rhetoric. Second to that, and increasing on that problem, is the rise of a polarizing social media. Increasingly, algorithmic platforms are driving us to celebrate and reward divisive and extreme content, language, and rhetoric, and it is at the same time defunding and de-incentivizing good journalism at the expense of increasingly polarizing, aggressive, non-factual, and even conspiratorial content, media, conversation, rhetoric, and analysis. And then finally, we take a long look at the pandemic and the ways in which the pandemic have supercharged those first two problems and made them even more intense and affecting than they would have been on their own. We heard from many people, including mayors of our major cities, politicians who have been in this game for a long time, and many, many youth from across the country that the pandemic, by keeping them inside, by rewarding conspiracy theorists, by defunding many of the shared spaces in which we normally congregate, made it so much easier to see enemies and conspiracies everywhere, including amongst our neighbors, including in our institutions, and really supercharged many of the ongoing dynamics that were already present in this country beforehand. Between these three things, it's very fair to say that Canada is a deeply polarized country today. To change this dynamic, to reverse this trend, it's going to require us recognizing that polarization is not something that is done to us. It is something we do to each other. It is the product of choices we make, and it could be choices that we make quite differently. And until we start making those choices differently, we're going to see the state of polarization continue to worsen, and we're going to see the state of our politics and our government and our society writ large continue to get worse. So, with that, thank you very much, and I'll leave it there.
Hi, my name is Sabreena Delhon, and I'm the CEO of the Samara Center for Democracy. Tonight, I'll be sharing some of our research that relates to polarization, and I'll explain how and why it is important for us to tell some better stories about our democracy. Some background to start: the Samara Center is a registered charity. We produce nonpartisan, evidence-based insights about how to strengthen Canadian democracy. Let me tell you about our Sambot project, which uses machine learning to measure abusive content received by candidates in Canadian elections on X, previously Twitter. Since 2021, we've analyzed over 4 million tweets received by over 1,000 candidates across a dozen elections at federal, provincial, and municipal levels. Across our reports, we found that candidates from all levels of government, from MPs to school board trustees, face high volumes of abuse online. We've seen LGBTQ+ rights are a particular vector for abuse, and that candidates from marginalized communities are targeted online. Women get some of the most personal and misogynistic content. Our most recent reports have found that only a handful of accounts are responsible for a disproportionate amount of abuse that we track. In our analysis of the 2023 Toronto mayoral by-election, we found that just 30 users accounted for 10% of all abusive tweets. In our forthcoming report on the 2023 Alberta election, we found that just 200 users published 12% of all tweets sent to candidates and political parties. Here is a small number of highly active users that are generating a disproportionate amount of abuse, shaping the story about the health of our democracy. This skews online political conversations, making them more hostile and less representative of the views of actual Canadians. This is enabled by social media platforms that amplify divisive content. The spread of abusive content normalizes hateful discourse and physical violence. It produces unsafe working conditions for active citizens. This all fuels affective polarization, as Justin mentioned. This means that Canadians see themselves as more divided, and they experience more negative feelings towards those with different political views. It doesn't mean that Canadians are truly more divided, but there's a perception that we are, and this is a major concern. This creates a defining story about our democracy that is dark, and it obscures the abundant local acts of civic engagement that are happening in our communities every day. One of the most dangerous aspects of polarization is that it is self-reinforcing. The Canadian public has been polled extensively about our feelings on polarization. This then spurs conversations about how divided we are, and it leaves the public feeling scared, disempowered, and disconnected. The Canadian public has been asked much less about what we want to see in our politics, what we hope the future holds for our democracy. If we want to address the 21st century challenges that we're facing related to trust, risk, and information, we need curious, imaginative, and proactive approaches. This requires nuanced research that isn't just observing from afar and producing fast facts. We need research that is responsive, that is exploring how diverse Canadians are connected on policy issues, as well as the ways in which we disagree. These rich stories can shape informed solutions that help to build trust between the public and our institutions. This requires two things: culture of continuous improvement when it comes to our democracy, and adequate funding for the nonpartisan organizations that can produce this meaningful work. This kind of shift would give us some new stories to work from and could make a real difference in truly tackling the problem of polarization. Thank you.
My name is Sadia Zaman, and I'm the CEO of Inspirit Foundation. I'm going to shift gears here slightly, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about narratives and storytelling because they're central to how we see other people. They create mental models, which are those stubborn ideas. Once they get lodged in our brain, they're very hard to get rid of, and we start to perceive people or issues in a very rigid way. And this affects our behavior. And journalism, especially independent journalism, is really, really key to us being able to address some of these very stubborn mental models that we have about each other. One of the biggest signs of increased polarization in Canada is actually journalists being targeted more and more. We all know so many people who have had to take security precautions as a result of how their work has suddenly become so dangerous, something that we couldn't have imagined happening within Canada. It was certainly happening when folks were reporting from war zones and other places of high conflict. But it's not a norm within the industry here in Canada. And all of a sudden, we are in a space where our foundation actually had to provide some funding to help journalists stay safe so that they could access resources so that they could do their jobs. We're living in an information ecosystem that accelerates polarization. Both Justin and Sabreena have alluded to online spaces. Those spaces seed enough chaos, just enough so that you begin to question everything. And that means all kinds of journalism, regardless of where it's coming from. No one knows what is accurate anymore. No one knows whose framing is driving the stories. Certainly, people feel left out of the coverage that they're seeing. They feel very marginalized in the coverage that they're seeing. And many people feel that the coverage will never reflect them. This is a whole other issue around polarization. Trust is also hyperlocal. By that I mean we tend to trust the sources of information that are local the most. This is a problem because in Canada, since 2008, we've lost more than 500 local media outlets. In that same amount of time, more than 200 have started up. 160, some of those are still going. These are all digital outlets. But there's a huge gap at the local level. That void is filled by other actors. Municipalities, especially smaller spaces, smaller cities and towns, are seeing civic engagement that has become much more polarized than anything that they've seen in the past. It's because of that void, and in that void, all sorts of other misinformation is starting to spring up. In the work that we do, we try to think of the way that we can influence that hyper local level, a local media that is credible. So, to that extent, we've started to talk about a local journalism fund that is equitable, that is actually also represents communities that have been excluded, historically excluded. And I'll talk a little bit later around identity based polarization because I think that's another issue that we really need to talk about a lot more in this country. I want to also talk a little bit about some solutions. Um, we have some very, very good examples from south of the border. They've been in this space longer than we have. Pace Funders has done language analysis around polarization. There's absolutely language that increases polarization and language that decreases it. Another organization called More in Common literally found out that literally the us versus them dynamic of most media coverage is a turnoff. Americans want more narratives of the us as a collective, ways to come together instead of dehumanization and the them. So I will leave it there. Thank you.
Hi there. My name is Amie Archibald-Varley. I'm a nurse and I have my master's in women's health. I also host the podcast, Degree Nurse. I'm the CEO of Advancing Health Equity Together. And I'm also the author of The Wisdom of Nurses, a Globe and Mail and Toronto Star national best-selling book. So what are we talking about today? And I think as you probably can hear me, I have a cold. I have walking pneumonia. It's something that's definitely going around. But what we're talking about is polarization, and particularly polarization around healthcare and health misinformation. The term itself, misinformation, has become very polarized. And as a nurse, I've seen some of the most devastating effects ripple through COVID-19 and continuing through my practice and working as a health equity specialist. You probably know this because you're all journalists and speaking to a lot of folks who do research. Really, right now, 70% of Canadians go online to search for their medical and health related information. And it's been reported that most they more likely to trust the internet versus their own physicians or other healthcare providers, or even bringing that information to their care providers. The Canadian Medical Association reported in a 2024 study that showed that Canadians trust people that they know personally. So, their friends, their neighbors, and coworkers more than journalists, and even more than government leaders. Not too surprising there. But again, I want to talk to you about something that is important to me, and it's the polarization that happens probably closest to home with your family, your friends, and your coworkers. Particularly in this situation, it was with me and my father-in-law. We had a great working relationship, a great, daughter and father-in-law relationship. And then the pandemic hit. He has known me for over 23 years, know that that I worked as a nurse, and knowing that my work is rooted in evidence-based practice. But we have gone to the era of or the rise of I did my own research. The other piece was, particularly in healthcare, we went from banging pots and pans to yelling, abusing healthcare workers, and even seeing blockades in hospitals. And when this conversation came around that Thanksgiving dinner table, those lovely conversations about healthcare that would normally be those ones that would gross people out, it became highly polarized, highly political. And this is where that polarization happened within the family effect, which was devastating. This polarization has ripped families apart, had many folks not being able to speak about healthcare and the way that healthcare interacts with us from a political standpoint. Many of his own healthcare decisions at this point are solely based around some of the news misinformation that he's read from various different sources from the United States, as well as I would say is there was a lot of bots that were spreading misinformation about COVID-19. And again, there was definitely international interference and political interference at that time. Unfortunately, there's so much health misinformation online. And again, not only does it impact the relationships that we have with our friends and families and the way that I might have health conversations, but it also affects racialized and indigenous communities, Black communities disproportionately. Well, how do I know this? Let's take a slice of what happened with COVID-19 and just for example, the Peel region. We saw various pockets of places with low socioeconomic income, racialized communities, folks that had had jobs that would force them to be working in factories, and we saw these people have some of the most devastating effects related to COVID-19. Again, we've seen when we're talking about health equity, we're hoping that, and the achievement is to have equity for all people having the same types of healthcare outcomes. But when we're seeing this misinformation, we're seeing that it's definitely hitting hardest some of our racialized communities. And again, this misleading health content it can put people's lives at risk. And again, it is such a dangerous aspect where if we're not talking about healthcare, it can be truly devastating in terms of the fact that the information is misguided. So lastly, before I run out of time, I want to talk about the safety concerns that I have. And I cannot tell you more times that I've been told that I'm going to be strung up for Nuremberg trials or the death threats that I've read. They've been credible. And I know that racialized women tend to be targeted. So we do all have a job here and a role to play in fighting misinformation, and particularly in healthcare. It's talking about how we debunk false information. We need to use the tools that we have at hand to combat health misinformation, correct explanations, speak out against mistruths in terms of, various different lies about, vaccines or things causing autism. And we have a duty as healthcare providers and as the general public to speak to our communities, friends, and families at those Thanksgiving tables about health literacy. I think health literacy will be one of the most and key components and storytelling to change and transform this landscape in terms of politicization and health misinformation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amie Archibald-Varley. We also heard from Justin Ling, Sabreena, Delhon, and Sadia Zaman. No one should receive death threats for doing their job. Thank you for highlighting what it is that we're talking about. We're now going to open it up to the audience. So I want to check in, see how everyone's doing. Let us know where you are joining us from today. Where do you live? Or where are you visiting? Okay, welcome. We have audience members registered from all over. Hello to Lethbridge, Kingston, Abbotsford, Victoria, Dartmouth, Vancouver, Edmonton, Winnipeg, Montreal, Sherbrooke, and Nanaimo. Wow, thank you so much. I love the ability of being in conversation truly across the country. Thanks to everyone who's already posted a question in the comments section, and it's not too late. If you have anything you'd like to add to the Q&A portion, please submit it in the Zoom chat. Now I'm going to welcome back all of our talkers, get them to turn the cameras back on as we move in to the discussion. Lots to get to here. Justin, I'd like to start with you, and thank you so much for your report. I really encourage our audience to download it from the Public Policy Forum because you go into such detail. You mentioned in your talk, we do polarization to each other. When did it start becoming so hard to disagree or even to agree? Sometimes I have to tell friends and colleagues, I violently agree with you. Because even the way we talk, not just on social media, but does it come from that culture of social media?
Yeah. I mean, listen, it's hard to disentangle social media as a factor. We do identify some, IRL problems as well. For example, party financing, political financing in Ottawa has been changed, I think, for the good over the last 20 years to get rid of, money in politics, to get rid of corporate and union donations. That's a good thing. The problem is the unintended consequence of this is that increasingly you're relying on small donors. And at the same time as we did this, we got rid of public subsidies for our political parties. It made them more and more reliant on grassroots donors. Now, again, not necessarily a bad thing. What we started to find, however, is that parties became more and more reliant on email blasts, on petitions, on social media asks. So there is an internet dimension to this. And parties increasingly turned up that rhetoric to basically eke out more money as campaigns got more and more expensive. That has a polarizing effect. We saw the impact of streaming Parliament online. We now have MPs who are who used to be quite serious about how they engaged in the House of Commons, used to be quite constructive. They're now mugging for the camera. They can literally watch the camera on them as they're talking, and they clip frequently their interventions, both in the House of Commons, at committee, at press conferences, elsewhere, and they use them to reach out to their members, to reach out to their supporters, to raise money. There's also an increased expectation of individual MPs in raising money. So there is both an IRL and an online dimension of this. And I'll just say really briefly, a big factor in this is the algorithmic pressures that Facebook and Twitter and YouTube put on our politics. This has been going back now for about a decade, but it's really, I think we've seen the consequences of it over the pandemic and over the last couple of years. For example, we have some great information that's been leaked from Facebook that has, and I relied on some of it for the report. It shows specifically how Facebook knew and was told by political operatives, mostly in Europe. They knew that the changes they were making to the news feed was rewarding anger-inducing content, that they were basically ginning up Facebook posts and links and videos and whatnot and memes that were making people angry. And Facebook didn't care because the incentive for Facebook is to get more people engaged and to sell more ad dollars. Facebook doesn't care about the state of our democracy. YouTube and Google, they don't care about the state of our politics. In particular, now Twitter, owned by Elon Musk, a guy who is both steeped in polarization and who keeps saying he wants to polarize people, is doing things that make us angry. And we're letting it all happen. These are decisions we're making. Every day that we engage in these platforms, they're making us a little more angry and a little more polarized. And every year our politicians keep playing into this. It keeps making us a little more wild and feral in some ways. So, there's a lot of dimensions to this, and it's not just that it's online spaces. There's an interplay between online and offline, between IRL and social media. And so it's not enough to just fix the social media component. We have a real life problem as well.
Sadia, I'd like to bring you in here. How can we best support local news versus other sources of information, misinformation, disinformation? Because a lot of people do tune into YouTube or other social media platforms to get their news or news.
Not all social media platforms are bad. There is some experimentation going on in this country, actually, to try and change the local conversation, which I'm really excited about. I don't know where that's going to lead, but to get away from exactly what Justin was talking about, to create even more hyper local communities. We're also involved in a project called the Documenters, which is literally journalists sitting down with people and talking to them in smaller groups to try and build trust. These are all models that came from the US. They are ahead of us by decades on the journalism front, just because government there has never supported journalism. And we've had supports in various different ways, whether it's through labor tax credits and other ways as well. There is never the expectation that the state is actually going to support any form of journalism in the US. So they have a very, very vibrant history of independent media as well as other kinds of media that are funded by foundations, by other donors as well. Now, the good and the bad of that is that's also highly ideological. And I think in Canada, we haven't quite reached that point. However, we have funders in this country funding misinformation and disinformation, which is a huge, huge problem that I think we really need to address head on. These outlets are actively fueling hate. They're actively fueling um, all sorts of misinformation around particular groups, around particular events. People mention, the pandemic keeps coming up over and over. Some of these groups highly involved in that as well. So I think our only way of addressing this through the work of the foundation is to try and continue to build a hyper local ecosystem and try to continue to fund people who are in that ecosystem so that at the local level we can, we have tiny little kind of outlets coming up here and there, and that they're well funded and they can continue to have some influence at that hyperlocal level. But this is work that requires significant resources, and it would require some sort of you know, um, a, I think some sort of a conversation in this country around how much money we are willing to put into that hyperlocal ecosystem to buffer civic engagement, but also, to protect our democracy. Because democracy also lives at the hyperlocal level. And if you start to see it erode there, you start to see it erode in lots of different places.
Thank you for that. Amie, when you were talking about what we went through and what you're still navigating in healthcare, it made me think of being at the pharmacy to get one of my vaccines and watching a man scream at the pharmacist, racialized women, and her just calmly respond. You can tell she had dealt with it before and go to action, and basically got him out of the pharmacy. And I'm wondering, when do you not engage in a polarizing conversation and shut it down, versus when might it be with a family member or a patient or a neighbor? When do you engage? Could you give us some context? Because I'm sure you've had to do both quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think violence is never the answer. So again, in any of the conversations that I've been having, for me, that's a non-starter. As soon as someone has raised their voice, has called me a name or a racial slur, the conversation at that point is done. And it's not done because I've given up. I don't want to talk about health misinformation. We've now moved to another form of an attack, which isn't a personal one. So for me, those are non-starters. That's when the conversation will end for me. Particularly, I will talk to anybody about healthcare and the facts surrounding whether it's vaccines, whether it's healthy information, any of those things. I'm willing to have a conversation with anybody about. I would say that, we have to start thinking about how we have conversations differently. Again, think even the word polarized is polarized. When we think about, our opposites, and we have to start seeing, the folks that we live, we eat with, we commune with, that they are still our neighbors. They're still our friends. They're still people that we have to interact with, the grocery store person, the person at the pharmacy. And again, we've seen this kind of erosion of 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 civil behavior. I think that's probably the best thing to call it, where people are feeling more emboldened to act in these certain ways where they're showing this type of aggression or violence, towards a healthcare worker. And we need to start having conversations surrounding that. And I think again, this is where journalists, healthcare journalists, we need to really call it what's happening. But again, when we're seeing that anger, it's coming from a place, and we have to try to understand where that's coming from. So that's meeting people where they're at, particularly, again, in my role as a health equity specialist, it's really getting to the root of why people might not wanna seek out care, because there are some historical mistrusts around, healthcare towards with Indigenous people or Black communities. We have seen those mistrusts. So again, we have to have conversations, meet people where we're at, and there's gonna be a lot of work to do in health literacy. There's such a large number of folks that, they don't know when the best time to seek care is, or they don't know because they're accessing information online and it's not the best place to get it. The best place to get your health information is from a certified medical professional. And we need to get people back there. But I think it will start with a huge federal plan on health literacy.
Well, chat is on fire. I'm going to get to audience questions after this question for Sabreena. In the book Bowling Alone and the documentary on Netflix, Join or Die, there's an argument that joining a club helps us connect with more people. It leads to belonging and understanding and better health, which is great. Sabreena, in the work you do around democracy, what else might you suggest to break through polarizations in our families and communities? How can people get involved in a way that's positive and productive?
Well, I think those are such good examples because it helps us understand that this isn't a problem that just started today and is brand new, right? This sense of civic connection and being connected in your community has been an issue that we're navigating for a really long time. One of my favorite scholars, Hari Han, is quoted in that or interviewed in that documentary, and she talks about democracy isn't something that you just passively receive. It's something that you're actively contributing to. It's a practice. And so if we want to turn the page on these really kind of frustrating and binary conversations where we don't have a lot of space to maneuver, we need to understand that there's so much more to the public than being angry or apathetic. And there's so much more to civic engagement than just voting or running in an election. So, in my remarks, I alluded to the fact that there's lots of wonderful civic acts happening at the local level all the time. And I think in Canada, culturally, we have, we're very polite. There's a lot of trepidation, although we're talking about a lack of civility here. We're too modest to really take a lot of pride and really highly value the fact that during the pandemic, people helped their neighbors get their groceries, that we are actively volunteering for our kids' school events, that we participated in some sort of park cleanup. We're actually already doing it. And I think there's a sense that people feel like they're starting at zero as an active citizen, that they didn't get a good grade in their social studies class in high school, so the door is closed, right? But I think we have to help set this framing that there are multiple gateways to being an active citizen. You're actually already doing it. You don't have to, be reading X number of newspapers per day or have a, dogged position in terms of your policies and parties that you support. You just need to be what you already are, which is by and large, in Canada, a decent person. And I think the sense of proportion is really important here as well. In 2019, we published a study where we talked about how 47% of Canadian social media users were steering clear of online political conversations because they were afraid. So we really need to shift our focus to the decent majority here and also look at a bigger picture and try to be more ambitious and courageous and value those more local acts of civic engagement, because then I think it will help us understand, like, we're going to get these platforms under control, and most of these accounts causing all this trouble are bots anyway. Like, we can handle this, but we have to come together on that.
I remember in Harihan's research, she spoke with people at anti-abortion rallies and protests, and a significant amount of them said they went not because they had a stance on the issue, but because they were invited. And it's the power of invitation and being asked to join something, and that can go in any direction. So yeah, that really stood out for me. All right. From our audience, Jesse asks, many of us are tuning in from urban or suburban areas today, and it often feels that the divide in our country not only runs along partisan lines, but geographical ones too. How do we bridge that urban-rural divide and the animosity that seems to exist between the two groups today? Justin, I know you wrote about this in your report. If you could speak to that.
Yeah, I I think there's one thing that sometimes gets left out of this conversation, and it's that, polarization is not in and of itself a bad thing, right? Like, it's not it is to some degree the natural state of our political system, right? Canada has been polarized from its very inception. English, French, rural, urban, um, Protestant, Catholic, East, West. The polarization is a fact of our system, and even on intense social issues, whether it's gay marriage, whether it's expanding the franchise to vote, whether it's reconciliation, these questions are inherently polarizing. The big question about polarization is to whether or not it produces constructive and thoughtful progress in politics, or whether or not it descends into basically fighting, tribalism and oppositional rhetoric. Is whether or not you can disentangle those problems, right? And that's really the crux of it, right? If government can't do it, can the media do it? If the media can't do it, can civil society do it? If civil society can't do it, can our communities do it? And we've always had a really interesting interplay with how you create new systems to respond to polarization becoming destructive as opposed to constructive. The problem we're facing right now is we've uploaded an awful lot of this to the internet, and to parties and organizations that don't seem interested in depolarizing, but seem more interested in increasing polarization, right? So I already mentioned Facebook. They've mentioned some of our political parties, right? And it's easy, I think, to put this at the feet of one particular political party, right? I mean, I think the Conservative Party bears a tremendous amount of blame, as does Pierre Poilievre, for increasing the rhetoric here. But as we note in the report, Justin Trudeau and the and Jagmeet Singh and the NDP, both of them have frequently de-incentivized collaboration, compromise, conversation, agreement, even constructive sort of opposition. Increasingly, we are seeing politicians, as well as figures in the media, as well as influencers online, turn politics and conversation into blood sport instead of, good-natured conversation in the public square. And so if the question is, how do we get to something that can bridge those divides, whether it is rural or urban, indigenous, settler, whatever, how do you bridge those? Well, we need to start thinking seriously about how we rebuild the institutions that helped us disentangle those problems, or alternatively, if those institutions are just not fit for purpose, how do we build new ones? What does it look like to build a new media? And I know we've heard Sadia and Sabreena talk about the need to tell stories and create better local journalism initiatives that can do that. That's a great start. But how do you do that at scale at a national level? How do you create systems again that get us talking, maybe not agreeing all the time, but at least talking to everybody? How do you create online systems? I know there's some local social media attempts at that. Blue Sky is kind of my new favorite thing these days that is trying to do some of this. But frankly, we've not seen this happen at scale on a national level. And that is the thing we need to solve if we want to turn this polarization into constructive politics as opposed to destructive.
Thank you, Amie. The next audience question is for you from Boardwalk Group. How can we tackle these issues in a preventative way? Sounds upstream. If we really do a root cause analysis, and the issue is, as Amie was saying, health literacy, critical reflection, empathy, belonging, that allow people to feel safe, connect, and hold space for one another. So yeah, how can we prevent this? It's a good question for you.
My mom would always say, like, prevention's better than cure. Um, and I think this is where I said we need to meet people where they're at. Some of these conversations that we label as difficult, that we label as polarized, they're conversations that need to be had, because one of the things that I would like to say is, when we're talking about healthcare and polarization, various different conversations in terms of political debates, you might not be concerned about someone losing their life. Well, in healthcare, we are, particularly when we're talking about, the idea and state around polarization. Just even bringing it back to one quote that I wanted to mention, that, over 17,000 people died because of health misinformation by taking various different drugs, anti-cancer treatments, not going for any forms of treatment, or trying things that, were well debunked. And at the end of the day, for some people, they might see that as a gotcha. In healthcare, we see that as a failure. There's so much moral injury on our side to say, like, what more can we be doing to prevent this? So again, we need to have an upstream approach. We need to meet people in those rural communities. We need to have conversations with people we might not want to have conversations, to find out why, what are their concerns about, this health information, where they might be getting it. We have to understand and get back to that rudimentary sense of building community and having humanity for one another. Because if we don't do that, we're not gonna solve any problems. We have to understand where these ideas are coming from, where this rhetoric is coming from, where they're getting this information. And then that's the time we have opportunity as, healthcare leaders, as politicians, to debunk that. For me, I'm the debunk science queen. Whatever you bring to me, let's talk about it. We'll sit and we'll have a conversation. Where did you find that resource? Well, let's see if this is a credible research. Most people haven't been taught how to look for credible health information online. So these are the things that we need to do as healthcare providers, that the government needs to see as an initiative in terms of health literacy. And yeah, it's going to be grassroots. We got to talk to people and understand where they're coming from.
Hear a lot of curiosity and care in that, Amie. Thank you. Sadia, this is from Mara. Can you expand on the comment about types of language that lead to polarization, and what language should be used in discussions between polarized groups to promote unity?
Yeah, this is a really good question. The report by PACE funders, I would encourage you to look it up. This was done after the 2020 election, and it's an American. We don't have anything comparable in Canada. This was what they did is they tested a lot of phrases that had been used repeatedly throughout the election cycle. Words that we commonly might use, like justice, social justice, language like that, and the visceral response to a word like that, as opposed to community, the difference, right? Like, so just really parsing out the words that we use, and they actually do a really, really good job of kind of identifying the words. Now, it's American. We have a slightly different culture up here in terms of the way we speak, and that politeness that Sabrina's mentioned this a couple of times means that we're much more passive aggressive about our language up here. And I think it would be amazing to be able to get a handle on language within the Canadian kind of ecosystem that is fueling polarization. I wish I knew. We have a lot more information on political rhetoric than we do about language from identity-based groups, some of whom are challenging power because they've been historically underrepresented and underfunded and under-resourced. Now, at what point does their right, or our right, I would say, to actually fight for equity become polarization? This is a really big question for many of us, and this is huge, but we're not talking about it. And I do think that some of the language that's used by a lot of groups that are fighting for equity um, could be put under some sort of a microscope to see what is polarizing and what is not. But at the same time, um, the fight for justice is also very real. And how do we square that with the polarization that that causes for others? And so this is a big question for all of us. Do we stand behind some of those movements for justice? And would we be more willing to stand behind some of those movements for justice if the language and the way of engagement was changed or could change? But at the same time, I don't know. Maybe the results would be the same. But we don't have any information around that in Canada. So that which is why I had to use the American model.
Well, Sadia, you'll laugh, but I'm a cyclist, and that's become very polarizing. So I even test language when I'm in a rideshare or a taxi, just because I don't know I'm a cyclist. So I'm like, let me try this different language. So thank you so much for sharing that. Final question for Sabreena. Briefly, this is from Rashi. How much does Canadian politeness, which you've mentioned and Sadia just referred to as well, get in the way of fostering a sense of belonging? And what effect does it have on polarization and the willingness to have a difficult conversation? Because I had a friend the other day who said, I disagree with you. It felt so refreshing. It's like, yeah, we should be disagreeing. Like, that's okay.
Yeah,
Healthy,
yeah.
right?
It's okay. It's okay to not see eye to eye. I think what we are experiencing right now is the pandemic told us to be far apart from each other, pushed us all online, younger people as well. Lots of kids were online that wouldn't have been otherwise for 2 straight years. And then now coming out of that period, we don't know how to be, and we need some coaching and help with that. And just to say that we don't need to be nostalgic about the past. We can think in big, bold ways about what we want to come next for our democracy. And we can find ways to have social platforms be regulated for pro democracy ends. So, that urban rural divide question we had earlier, we can have some connection through social media platforms that bring common ground about in that way. So I think maybe instead of it being reactive to all the horrible things, if we could find some space to be thinking in terms of what we actually want for our future together in terms of our democracy, then we could get over the polarization thing and focus more on the big picture. And it's okay to be angry, that can be healthy, but it's when it's in anti-democratic hands that we fall into trouble.
Well, we've reached the end of our Q&A. A big thank you to all of our talkers. Also, everyone in chat, just such thoughtful questions. And this has been such a lively conversation. Thanks again to our speakers as they turn off their cameras. We heard from Justin Ling, Sabreena, Delhon, Sadia, Zaman, and Amie Archibald-Varley. I'd now like to welcome Mohammed Hashim, Chief Executive Officer and Executive Director of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, to say a few words.
Well, thank you for this incredibly vibrant conversation, but also the bringing of people together. I don't think, I mean, we know very well that like the society is divided and it's polarized. Like, what does that actually mean? It means that we keep to ourselves. It's hard for us to hear people who disagree with us. It means more and more we see people as good if they agree with us and evil if they don't agree with us. We have become believers of our feeds, and we know social media has been curating um, our feeds to feed us what um, that which we most love, fear, and desire. And we have become slaves to that. And we know social media is a problem. what is the solution? Is it the solution that the government creates like a torque where we can control emotionally charged degrees by which content is being fed to people or not? Is that a responsible thing to do or not? Do we, but maybe not. I don't know. Because if polarization is what we're trying to tackle, if that is the right mechanism to do so, or is it just to say, if you hear what happens, what is shared online can't be AI generated or has to have some fact checking, or that if there's news that is false, that there's ways to flag it, that create a sense of at least some standardization of understanding of what is true or what is not, because right now so much of what is driving our emotions is coming from all types of different places. um we know that um the antidote to hate is empathy. At the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, we work on public policy related to hate crimes in particular significantly. We contributed a significant amount of our energy and understanding to Canada's anti-hate combating hate action plan. And we know that there's many gaps in the systems that need to be addressed. Undoubtedly true. But, I can't remember if it was Justin or somebody else that said, the solution is not simply for us to just wait to be invited to be with people, but like being with people is what the antidote to hate and polarization is, where we can learn to understand each other, empathize with each other, and to be in community. And there's no other powerful way for us to fight for the future than to ensure that we create that space and expectation for us to be with each other. I don't think so if there's opportunities for you to be in real life with humans you could engage with in a thoughtful way, find those opportunities. Don't wait to be invited. Find them. Invite people if you know where those conversations exist. But the way to not do it is to just leave it so that, and I think that the government is going to solve or somebody else is going to solve this issue for you. This has to be investment in all of us, from you to all of us. The foundation is working on this. We have been curating conversations like this across this country, and we're going to continue doing so, because I think that's not just important for us to get together online, but we're going to be doing it in person as well. And we invite you to participate in that, because without those relationships, we really are going to lose ourselves. So I'll conclude there and just say thank you to the Walrus for organizing this, and to the Inspirit Foundation for co-joining and sponsoring this great event, and thank you so much for all of you for being here. Back to you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. And I think that's something we can all do, is take your advice and have conversations with people around us, but strangers, take off our earpods and stop the scrolling. There's so many people around who I think would be willing to engage in conversation. I also have to read a comment that just popped up in chat. This is from H. We're a group here in Ottawa, a bunch of folks with diverse views watching this right now. So thank you so much for being in community with us tonight. If you enjoyed this conversation, we have more coming up in the new year. Yes, we're at the time of the calendar where we can say, see you next year. Keep an eye on your inbox. You're going to receive an email follow-up. In that, we'll be sure to include Justin Ling's research and report on polarization that was mentioned. We also will have a recording of this talks. I know someone was asking if they could share it with friends. Opt into our newsletter if you're not already on the Walrus newsletters. That's the best way to stay in touch with us. You can also visit us at thewalrus.ca/events. That's where we post our upcoming events and all of our talks in the Walrus Talks video room. The Walrus is independent. When we talk about independent local media, that's what we're trying to do over here. And we are supported by our community. That means our journalism, our events, they're made possible by people like you. We're a registered charity with an educational mandate, and we rely on our community of support for independent, fact-based journalism and thought-provoking events. So if you enjoyed this free event, consider joining our community of donors and supporting Canada's conversation. You can donate to the Walrus at thewalrus.ca/support to ensure that we can continue doing this work. Thanks again to our partners tonight, Canadian Race Relations Foundation. We just heard from Mohammed, and then Inspirit Foundation. We heard from Sadia in the talks. Thank you to our annual sponsors, Air Canada, Bullfrog Power, Inspire, RBC Emerging Artists, and Rogers. And thank you all for tuning in. I leave this conversation with a lot of empathy and hope. Have a great evening.